importance of culture, I suppose. We've been talking a lot today about digital and the primary motivators and drivers of purchase and of how IT and how digital is becoming an integrated part of marketing. What I want to do is just say add one extra dimension, which is the notion of what I would call cultural dissonance. This is Beijing. It's where I spend an awful lot of my time. And I am not surprised that people are not interested, because I think there's a factor here that quite a lot of people are missing, which is the Chinese are coming. And indeed, they are in many instances already here. They have huge amounts of disposable income. They're buying into brands across the world, not just in terms of buying huge assets, whether it be football clubs or involved in Hinckley or whatever, but they're not going away. And with President Xi's focus on outbound, that's only going to increase. And I just want to play this.
Instant control. Fancies his chances. Oh, brilliant goal! Remember the name! My goodness me! That is one of the strikes of the season! One moment of madness. A straight red. The best moment yet in the mercurial career! Brilliant kicked out there. That will mean a suspension.
Look in the mirror and ask yourself what you did for your country tonight.
My contention is that not only does emotion sell brands, but that individual is probably better known in China, almost, and certainly in terms of numerics, than he is anywhere else in the world, as is Nike. One of the things about working at a global level is that stereotypes drive decision-making. Of course, data does too, but stereotypes, when I'm in China, people have a certain understanding and a perception of the UK, which may be surprising. Clearly, they will see London. They will see the attributes that the British have of stiff upper lip, of our word is our bond, of beautiful countryside, of royalty, of carriages, and of kings. And there's a stereotype that drives their ethos and their interest, which is driving dollars, pound notes into the UK in terms of tourism. But you could argue and be upset by the fact that they've got it all wrong. We're far more than that. We're far more than fish and chips and poor quality food, which is what they believe. We're far more than certain aspects of the stereotypical view of us. And yet, when you look back towards China, you will have, unless you're extremely unusual, you will have your own stereotypical views of that country. You will be beset with the views of human rights. You will remember the 4th of June, 1989, Tiananmen Square, Tank Man. You will probably have views of Tibet. You'll have views of millions and millions of people producing low-cost, low-quality goods, which is essentially a view of the past. You have a view of the cuisine, largely driven by the fact that until very recently, most Chinese food here in the UK was actually Cantonese food, came out of Sichuan food, came out of Shenzhen and Guangzhou and the Cantonese-speaking area of southern China, and particularly Hong Kong. So we have stereotypical views of the world. And unfortunately, as marketers, we tend to subconsciously, if you like, in an unconventional way, I suppose, have predetermined bias, which overlays our thinking and the way we do marketing to this particular segment. And we've just talked about segmentation, which I believe in absolutely, but I think one of the elements that is left out is this notion of culture. And not only culture at a country level, but culture at a local level. And culture at a local level does affect the way that people look, think, feel, and execute on things. So I just want to give you some examples of how culture in China is very different to culture here. They are somewhat amusing, but they are true. So when you look at something like the truth, we see an apple and an apple. So we'll speak an apple and we'll think an apple. The Chinese won't. They know that it's appropriate to speak an apple, so they'll speak an apple. They will think a pear. So at a very basic level of a cultural dissonance, all the research you do about the Chinese is likely to be wrong. In the West, the whole notion of hierarchy, structure, organizational systems is essentially around equality. That's not the case in China. China has 5,000 years of imperial rule, and despite the Cultural Revolution of Mao and the change to Xi Jinping, nevertheless, emperors run China, whether you take that to Xi Jinping's position or you go to an individual corporate basis. I work inside a Chinese firm. I'm the only Wagyu Laowei external face in the firm in the Beijing office, and the emperor runs the business to the extent that, I like exaggerate to make the point, he will be the person who will decide whether the toilet paper is left in the toilet rooms over the weekend, and by and large it's not, because if it was left there, people would take it. Decision making and, if you like, opinions. In the UK and in Western psychology, we often will go direct to a decision. We'll have a very clear view of what the objective might be and how we'll get there. The Chinese will go around every single point in the room to establish consensus and understanding, only at the end of the day then to come to a decision. So that's why doing business in China is often one of frustration for many Western businesses. And I spend my life advising businesses on how to do business in China and how to build their brand in China and how to deal with the Chinese coming into the West, because the decision-making process is fundamentally different. And all that I'm making in the point here is that the notion of the way that you do things here or in the West and the data and analysis you have doesn't apply. And as the Chinese increasingly start to invest and as the Chinese start to come over here, we're going to see significant changes as a result of last night's result, an election, that is going to change the landscape of Chinese purchasing. It says up there in restaurants in the UK, we're all very muted, we're very polite to each other. That is not the case in a Chinese restaurant. There is huge noise, there's a huge amount of energy in the room, because when Chinese are enjoying themselves, they speak more loudly. And we see the effects of that, which we regard as rather annoying from maybe particularly mainland Chinese speaking very loudly in the street. We see it as bravado, as brashness, as arrogance. It's not, it's because actually they're having a great time and they want to talk loudly about it. That's just the nature of the beast. And this is not just an Asian culture, it's particularly true in China. Coffee culture. I'm sure you're aware of the huge increase in the interest of the Chinese in coffee. Coffee is the new tea in China. Clearly, China invented the tea. We get all the rubbish, by the way, that they send us by taking off the tips of the tea leaf, which is the most essential element for tea, and we get the ground rubbish at the back end of it, which we happen to like and stick with milk. It's not true tea, but coffee is the new tea in China, and coffee culture denotes one particular essential element of the Chinese as a whole, and that is the rising middle class, of which, depending on whether you view it through the McKinsey eyes of around about 350 million or through the eyes of other people, then you will say, essentially, that when you look at places such as Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, the southern Pearl Delta area, or Beijing, you have in that area essentially over 60 million people, which is, as you will know, larger than the population of the United Kingdom. The Chongqing, Chengdu, Sichuan Basin, which you'll never have heard of, I'm sure, unless you're into pandas, has got 110 million people. Okay, of which there you've got a huge rising middle class. Chengdu now has a direct flight to London. In that location, we have somewhere in the region of 250 of the Fortune 500 businesses, and they're spending money. Coffee is an interesting market. We've got Costa now in China. McCafe is increasing its penetration in China. Starbucks is almost on every other corner in Shanghai, nearly on every other corner in Beijing. We're seeing coffee culture coming from Korea, Man Coffee, and others. That means there is huge opportunity for brands to connect with what is essentially a huge emerging middle class in China. And that offers opportunity, whereas we previously might not have thought about China before. Yes, there's a cost of entry. Yes, it's difficult. But you don't need to go there. They're coming here. The whole way they look at Apple clearly, the New York site, you'll be aware of, Apple is loved by the Chinese. However, so is Huawei and Xiaomi, and also a new brand called OnePlus. These are emerging telephony brands, mobile brands that are operating at the cutting edge of technology, both in analog, primarily in analog systems. So the brands that you know and love aren't the brands that the Chinese are buying. Yes, they love the iPhone and the iPhone 7. There's a celebrated case just last week in China where a woman who happened to have, I don't know how she managed to do this, accumulate 20 boyfriends, got them all to buy her an iPhone 7, sold all the iPhone 7s and bought an apartment. The whole notion of the way that people buy things and deal with things is fundamentally different. Mercedes, and I'll just pick up Mercedes, but particularly Porsche, I don't know if you're aware of the drivers of the Chinese market, which of course is the largest market. It's the largest market for many things, but it's the largest market for new cars. It's about to be the largest market for second-hand cars. So Mercedes in particular, and specifically Porsche, have changed the entire model. The entire modeling of the cars are focused on the Chinese. And the Chinese middle class and the Chinese elite don't drive the car. They have a driver to drive the car. They sit in the back, which is why the long wheelbase Panamera became Porsche's biggest selling operator and car in China, because the big guys sit in the back. So if you start to understand the psychology and the different way of thinking, then, for example, you will see the opportunities that occur by just thinking differently about the Chinese market. There was a case of, I had breakfast with a friend of mine this morning, and he told me last week, a number of Chinese were over, just friends of friends. They went into Selfridges, and while they were, the ladies went and bought a £5,000 Chanel bag, because she could, in cash. And that's another thing to remember, that the Chinese operate in cash. So the red back, and you will see this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Alipay and about the change to online and the fintech and the way it's being expressed in China. But the red back is gold, literally, in China. I've seen people physically go into stores and buy washing machines in cash. There are stories of Chinese buying cars in cash. The one thing that's changing, it's literally changed in the last year. Of the 650 million phone owners, 750 million phones in China, 650 million people are on WeChat, which is sort of a cross between Twitter, YouTube, you name all the social media things we have. Add to that fintech, the ability to pay for your bills and your goods and services using your phone. They are way ahead, way ahead of the stuff that we have over here. And indeed, just down the street, around the corner from where my apartment is, you can buy your vegetables by using a QR code from literally, the woman has a kind of stall about the size of this table, and she's using a QR code to transfer money straight into her bank account using Weixin. The world is changing. And the way the whole thing is now, the Chinese are increasingly looking at, and you've seen this in the way that many of the major banks and operators over here, they now have the ability to be able to take RMB as a trading currency. They're able to do deals using the China Pay system, and also now increasingly using and having the opportunity to use Weixin. So these are things that are going to disrupt the markets that the Chinese are going to. This is a brand you will not see in China. And I'm just going to talk about one particular thing. I don't know if you're aware of 11/11. 11/11 in China is a really big deal. Singles Day. Singles Day invented, really, by Alibaba, I guess, or Taobao. Biggest online shopping operation in the world. Last year, Singles Day, in one day, generated $14.5 billion worth of sales online. This year projected to be $20 billion and rising. They've extended out the one day, literally that's one day across China. It's going to be $20 billion spent online. So imagine the logistical problems they have of actually delivering all those goods and services quickly on the back of that. Because once you've paid for it, you've parted with your money, you want it. And the Chinese want it like now. So the entire distribution network around China is all about, there's JD.com and other distribution networks. These guys don't have a prayer. Because within China, you have a totally different approach to be able to buy goods, services, transport those goods and services, and deliver them to 1.4 billion people, some of which the locations are well out of the way in Western China, but they deliver it in ways that are essentially disrupting and changing the way that delivery is dealt with. So it's really just to comment as well about some of the loved brands we have, the Disneys of this world, are being disintermediated by the Chinese. The Chinese Wanda group really taking on Disney head-to-head. The site in Beijing, the Disney site in Beijing, just outside Beijing, it's been there, in fact, for nearly 10 years. They finally got permission to actually build on it. But Wanda is going to take them on. Wanda's just done one of the major deals with the film industry in Hollywood, looking to take over many more operations in Hollywood, looking to be the biggest film mogul in the world. There are films you've never heard of that are essentially the biggest box office hits in the world, but you've never heard of them because they're in China. But these, the designers that go with it, the people who are dealing with special effects, the high-level production operations are here in the UK. So I'm currently working with UK businesses that are interested in partnering with the Chinese, because one of the things the Chinese look at in this country is high-tech, digital, totally different areas where they're not able to operate. So I think what I'm saying really is that, yes, there's a Starbucks in every corner in around China, but the way that Chinese do business, the way they buy businesses, and the way they buy products and services is going to change your world. Now I don't happen to, I'm not a lover of China or a hater of China, I'm just trying to be more balanced. Because when you look at the numbers, the metrics and the opportunities that exist there, and indeed now here, this guy who's been thrown in the air is David. He's the owner of Home Inns. Home Inns is one of the biggest low-cost, sort of equivalents to Premier Inn, I suppose, hotel chains in China. And they have a totally different model. He is recently, I can say this, he is recently looking at purchasing one of the low-cost hotel operators in the UK, decided to withdraw because the return on investment isn't good enough, and he can get 7, 8, 9, 13% return by going into low-cost operators across Asia. But the interesting thing about this is that this guy is always on. He's always on Weixing. He's always on 24/7. I recently interviewed him. I've written a couple of books about China. I recently interviewed him for my third book. And literally within a few minutes of me sending him a Weixing note, he was back to me with finding a time to meet, sorting out his driver to come and see me, getting over, and coming and having the interview. The ability of the Chinese to be agile, which is a really point I want to make, is breathtaking. It can take a long time to make decisions, but their ability to be agile is breathtaking. And that's the thing that I said at my opening remarks this morning was about we're not fast enough. You're just not fast enough. One example was I had a Chinese company from Shandong, sort of southeast part of China, power company, one of the largest power companies in China, want to buy assets in the UK. It has taken 8 weeks for the lawyers in the company in the UK to decide whether the non-disclosure agreement can be sent over to China. China's left, they're gone. Not interested. If you can't do it, send it me now, then I'll go somewhere else. So they've gone into Europe to have a look at another company, the German company. And the guys are now saying, why? No, gone. Too late. Because they're agile, they've got money, and they're prepared to spend it. But right at the grassroots in China, you have these guys who are working on the docks in Xiamen. Xiamen is the old port of Amoy, the old Portuguese trading operation down the southeast of China. Xiamen Docks is one of the largest dock operators in the world. These are the people who have money, believe it or not. These guys, they're in their 30s. So most Chinese men, if they want to get married, and most do, by the time they're 30, if they have not got a house, they will find it very difficult to get a girl to marry them. So these guys save around about 52% of their salary. If they're actually, most of them will live with their parents until they get married, and then the daughter-in-law will come and live with the parents, or you will go and live with your parents. Because of cash, the cash economy, essentially, they will have a house. They will own, having paid for it, not using banks or bank loans, or those are increasing and mortgages increasing in China, but by cash available from all of their friends, their family, who would club together to provide that cash. So the way that people buy things is fundamentally different. The way that people drink is also interesting. There's a huge increase in craft beers into the UK. The beer on the table is Yanjing beer. Again, it has a 98% market share in central Beijing. Well, that's not bad. Yeah, I could do that. That'd be quite nice. Outside China, outside elsewhere, you'll find one brand you may have heard of, which is Qingdao, spelled TS. You would know it as Tsingtao. Qingdao comes from Qingdao, not surprisingly. Stole the technology and the information from the Germans, who were there when they left the brewery and all of the operations. One of the biggest brands that you've never heard of, say Yanjing beer, a client of ours. An immense amount of alcohol consumed in China, whether it be baijiu, which is the white spirit drinks that everybody can't remember any part of their previous existence when you drink, or indeed other products and services. So my point really is, across all of this, this great stuff that we're talking about and learning about today, back to segmentation and back to market opportunity. And I would say there remains, and there is coming, a huge market opportunity from the Chinese. I think it's starting now, it's growing now. If you're a luxury brand, or certainly if you're a brand that aspires to be a luxury brand, or aspires to utilize Britishness as a way of differentiating yourself in the marketplace, now is the time to look at China. Thanks very much.